Hey guys, I'm Heidi Prieb. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if this is your first time here. On this channel today, I want to talk about complex PTSD and what to expect realistically out of the recovery process. So this summer, I am rereading Pete Walker's incredible book, Complex PTSD From Surviving to Thriving. If you have been around this channel for a while, you've heard me recommend this book so many times by now, and I'm not going to stop. I promise I do not get any sort of commission out of recommending this book. It is just such an invaluable resource that has helped me so immensely on my own healing journey. And going through it again this summer has been a really interesting experience for me, because it's about 3 or 4 years after I picked it up for the first time. And in that time, I've done intensive trauma, attachment, and shame healing work. And I'm noticing myself reflecting quite a bit on what I thought the healing process would look like when I first read this book versus what I've actually gotten out of it, and the ways in which my life has tangibly changed since that summer that I picked it up for the first time. And I have kind of a sneaky reason for wanting to make this video, which is that I think a lot of people who struggle with complex PTSD in the early stages struggle immensely with even identifying with the term. It's so insidious because toxic shame and complex PTSD can give us this feeling of, oh, I'm just over-exaggerating. This is all in my head. I'm just whining about things. It wasn't that bad, right? I wasn't locked in an attic for years at a time as a child, ergo, there's no way that I could possibly have trauma, despite having all of these pervasive symptoms of trauma consistently rearing their heads and wreaking havoc on our lives. So if that's kind of the place that you're in, I want you to just keep an open mind as you go through this video and consider whether these 10 signs of recovery would make a significant difference in your life or not. And if even one of them would, I want to encourage you to give yourself the opportunity to begin developing in that direction. I'm not going to say that there's very little to lose in engaging in trauma work, because it truly does mean restructuring the way that we approach our lives and our relationships, and that can cause a lot of upheaval in our lives. But it also allows us a way out of this kind of emotional and mental chaos that tends to characterize the lives of those who struggle with complex PTSD prior to giving it a proper name, which naturally transitions me to the first point on this list. So the first thing I want to talk about today that characterizes a certain degree of recovery from complex PTSD or toxic shame is you're able to look back at your life, including a lot of the chaos and challenge and struggle that has been a significant part of it, and you no longer chalk all of that up to you just being a flawed and defective person. So this might include things like having severe difficulty in forming intimate relationships, whether that's friendships or romantic relationships, struggling to set and achieve goals that feel meaningful for you, consistently managing your mental or physical health, developing healthy communication skills, the list goes on. If you don't understand the root cause of these problems, which is, in the case of CPTSD, developmental trauma, it's likely that you're going to spend the majority of your life and your energy managing the symptoms of these problems. And then when you're unable to do so consistently because you're not really getting them at the root cause, you're just kind of playing whack-a-mole with them, the story you might tell yourself if you have that shame-bound personality is the reason I can't just get it together and be a normal person is because I am defective and flawed and there is something wrong with me. In the healing process, you're able to look back over your life, including the failed relationships, the ways in which you have let yourself down, the opportunities you missed, the mental health challenges you developed, the ways you neglected to take care of yourself, and you're able to give a proper name for the root cause of those problems, which is complex trauma. And framing it this way is likely to take a lot of shame out of your own self-concept, because you know that you are not just a failure who can't get anything right. You've been grappling with some really deep wounds that you were previously ill-equipped to cope with. Second thing you can realistically expect in the healing process from complex PTSD is you learn to seek enough solace in intimate relationships. And the reason I use enough here is because this isn't a redemption fantasy. Having complex trauma and deep interpersonal wounding from a young age does mean it's a pretty big uphill battle when it comes to forming and maintaining healthy relationships. But, as Pete Walker says, we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for good enough. For a lot of my early life, I kind of felt like I was living in this desert when it came to connection. I didn't have the skills to actually share my authentic self with people, And so I was only forming very superficial connections that weren't really enough to sustain me emotionally. And the problem with being in that kind of desert of loneliness was that anytime someone came by and they had a water bottle, even if there was poison in it, I would take it from them and drink it because there was this part of me that so desperately wanted to be seen on a deep level that I didn't really care what the cost of that was. And sometimes there was a really high cost, because often the only people I felt deeply seen by were other people who struggled with toxic shame and trauma themselves, and who, like myself for much of my early life, did not have healthy relating skills. And at this point in my life, I would say there are two people in my life who both know me very deeply and care about me in a fairly consistent way, as well as a slowly expanding circle of people who I believe it might be possible for me to form those types of connections with in the future. And having those connections is kind of like having a narrow river of fresh water through that desert. So it's not an ocean by any means, it's not an oasis in the desert, but it provides me with enough deep connection to sustain me. And what that means is that when someone walks by and they offer a water bottle that is poisoned, I can say, no thank you, I'm okay. And I can use the water that I have to strengthen myself enough to slowly keep expanding that river over time. So again, a healed state does not mean your life is suddenly bursting with deep, intimate connections, but it does likely mean that you no longer have to reach and cling to really unhealthy dynamics out of desperation. That's sort of what I consider healed enough on the relational level when it comes to toxic shame. Third thing you might be able to realistically expect in the healing process is an increased ability to recognize when you're in an emotional flashback and to be forgiving towards yourself about the less than perfect ways that you cope while you're in them. So experiencing an emotional flashback or a period of age regression very often leads us to grasping for primal coping mechanisms. So things like comfort eating, self-medicating, in some cases seeking out compulsive attention or sex. And in the recovery process, we can learn that the real problem is not that we lack self-control. It's that we're either triggered in some way or there is some feeling very alive inside of our bodies that we haven't yet found a way to consciously recognize and address. So our inner children are working overtime to try to seek out the comfort that we need. And at this point in my own life, I like to think of those kind of primal self-soothing behaviors that come online when I'm having an emotional flashback as my inner child desperately tugging on my sleeve, trying to get me to pay attention to something. So while it might be frustrating to see ourselves acting out in these ways, it can also be a wake-up call that there's something happening in our lives, or there's some situation that is triggering us that we haven't become consciously aware of, but that needs our attention. This could be a current situation, or it could be memories that a current situation brings up about a past trauma that we have left unprocessed, and that now wants our time and attention. And learning to work with those things is a very long process, but the important part is that in the healing process, we learn as much as we can to stop shaming ourselves for experiencing emotional flashbacks, and we can increasingly look at those periods as a call for our adult selves to step in and attend to whatever it is that our inner children are reacting to, with the love and compassion that was perhaps not available to us when we encountered the same types of triggers or challenges in our early life. Fourth thing you can realistically expect from the healing process when it comes to complex PTSD and shame work is you increasingly develop the ability to stand up for yourself without being in a fight response. So in his book, Complex PTSD, Pete Walker talks about the fawn response and the fight response being at kind of opposite ends of a continuum. So we might immediately self-abandon when someone seems displeased with us and just do whatever it takes to soothe and appease them. And then on the other side of that spectrum, we have the fight response, which is being in kind of attack mode when we assert our wants and needs. And in the middle of that spectrum is healthy assertiveness. So the ability to stand up for yourself in a way that is both firm but also respectful of others. And in my opinion, there is exactly one key to assertiveness, and that thing is the belief that you matter. If I know that I am a valuable, worthwhile person who cares about both myself and other people, it's actually pretty easy to learn where to set my boundaries and how to enforce them. But it is really hard to do that if I believe either that I'm a piece of garbage, or that I will never be happy until everybody else attends to my needs for me. And the further you move along in the recovery process from having a shame-bound identity, the more you're able to internalize the fact that you do matter and that your feelings and needs are important to you. And that's all that you need in order to set assertive boundaries for yourself. And again, that's a long process, but it is absolutely possible. Fifth thing you can realistically expect from the complex PTSD healing process is you start to develop increasingly good discernment about who to trust and in what capacity. And the latter is very important. So before I took on any sort of healing work in my life, I remember feeling like the only other people who kind of got me were other people who had some version of complex trauma, extreme attachment wounding, or toxic shame, or depression, or some other debilitating mental illness themselves. And I didn't put it in that language, right? The language that I kind of had at that point was, I'm messed up and I only get along with other messed up people. When I stand next to someone who I consider normal, I feel like a freak and I cannot wait to get out of there. And so what I tended to think was, because someone gets me and because they aren't put off by my kind of rotating door of neuroses that they see once they get close enough, that must mean that this is a good person for me to get really close to and to start to co-regulate with. Now, again, I would never have used that language at that time. I would think more along the lines of, thank God, another broken person, let's go party. And at this point in my journey, what I've learned is that yes, I'm probably forever, no matter how far I come along this road, going to relate best to those who also have a history of toxic shame or trauma. But in order to trust someone to be a good person for me to get really close to and to start co-regulating with, they also need to be reasonably good at self-regulating, the same way that I am now reasonably good at self-regulating. Otherwise, our relationship is going to become a giant mess of projections that it's really difficult to resolve, and that can be extremely emotionally and practically destructive. So you learn discernment about who to trust in what capacity and with what. And that discernment allows all of our relationships to get better because we have realistic expectations for them. Sixth thing that might happen in the complex PTSD healing process is you're increasingly able to navigate through making mistakes without brutal self-shaming. At the advanced levels, you can even have compassion for yourself as you move through mistakes, because your inner parent can lovingly let your inner child know that it's a good thing to be trying in life, and trying means you are going to get a certain proportion of things wrong. If you were brutally shamed for mistakes when you were young, it's highly likely that you internalize that same critical voice around making mistakes as an adult. But what a good enough parent does for their child is show up for them the hardest when they've made a mistake, because they know that that's when that child needs the most compassion, encouragement, support, and guidance. And you can train yourself to be that type of inner parent for yourself. So I've talked about this in a different video, but there's this song by the band Muna called Number One Fan, where there's this lyric in it that goes, I've been looking at myself in the mirror saying, don't leave me now, don't leave me now. And that is something that I have literally done during really bad toxic shame flare-ups, when I have truly messed something up in my life, in my relationships, when I have genuinely let myself down in some way. I look at myself in the mirror and I go, don't leave me now. This is when I need my own compassion the most, right? It doesn't really count as self-love if I only show up for myself and I only love myself on the days when I am doing everything right and it's really easy to love myself. It counts as deep, pervasive self-love if I'm able to show up and have compassion for myself when I'm struggling the most. And a big part of the complex PTSD healing process is learning to reparent yourself in a way that is loving, understanding, and patient. Because you now know that everybody makes mistakes, that is a part of life, and it is a good thing to make them. You don't need to hate yourself for not getting everything right the first time. Seventh thing you can expect to happen in the complex PTSD or toxic shame recovery process is that you start to have a restored faith that there are kind and competent adults out there who you have the ability to learn from. This is something that Pete Walker talks about extensively in his book. And he talks about his own process, which almost creepily mirrors my own, of first finding solace in a whole bunch of self-help and psychology books, and recognizing, the authors of these books seem both very intelligent and also very compassionate. And he describes that as helping to grow his faith that there were adults out there in the world like that, which helped him make the leap into therapy. And then that therapeutic relationship helped him make the leap into forming healthier relationships in his life outside of therapy. And that is almost word for word the exact process that I went through as well. So I found that when I was in the thick of my wounding, I was constantly unconsciously seeking out mentorship from people who I only connected with using my false self. So these were people who didn't really share my interests or values in a deep way. And so of course, I continuously ended up in situations where I felt like all of the adults are kind of incompetent and inconsiderate. But that's in large part because the basis of my interaction with them was an inauthentic one. I didn't really respect their intellect or values, but I was claiming to want to learn from them anyway. And that is a situation that sets us up for ongoing disappointment. It's only when we are choosing our mentors from our authentic selves, who truly know what we value and what interests us, that we're able to actually get the growth out of the whole shebang. For me, I think a big part of my healing process in this capacity was taking a degree in attachment theory and research, which I completed at the University of Roehampton, which is in London, England. And the professors at that school were so intelligent and such genuinely critical thinkers, but also they were deeply invested in the well-being of children. And just encountering and getting to learn from a group of people like that was healing on a deep level for me. It restored my faith in a large degree that there are highly competent adults out there who care about the same things I care about and are paying attention to the same things I'm paying attention to. And every time I encounter someone like that, I feel like a little part of my soul relaxes a little bit more into life. And that is ideally a continuously unfolding process that you go through as you heal from relational trauma. Learning that you can use your discernment to figure out who it's safe to learn from and who might just not be the best mentor for you. Eighth thing you might realistically be able to expect out of the CPTSD or toxic shame healing process is that you're increasingly able to take some risks in your life. And I'm not talking about the kind of desperate, reckless risks that you might take when you're driven from a place of toxic shame and you're trying to solve some problem or get some form of connection in a way that feels desperate and dire. I'm talking about having a stable enough life, which might take many, many years to build for yourself, that you actually feel like you can open yourself up to some genuine vulnerability, knowing that you will be there to help yourself pick up the pieces if it doesn't work out. So you can actually let your inner child kind of come out to play more in your day-to-day life because you've set up a life where you are self-protective enough to know that you will recognize your own limits when you reach them and enforce your boundaries where you need to. And as such, once again, you can take more risks and either fail more and learn from it, or reap some pretty cool rewards. Ninth thing you can expect out of the CPTSD healing process is that you slowly develop an awareness that your recovery is not going to look like anybody else's. So I think that when I was in the thick of my shame, I had this idea that healing was kind of like having the ultimate hiding place. Like I was always looking for ways in which I could hide away and disconnect from the person that I actually was. And when I started doing counseling and recovery work, I was like, this is great. I can eventually get to a place where I can hide my true self so deeply that nobody will ever know it was there. And the biggest kind of surprise in my own healing process was recognizing that actual healing was about reclaiming the person I actually am and no longer being ashamed to show that person to the world, and to let myself form connections with other people based on my authentic self. I think that if I could teleport back in time and tell myself like 5 years ago that this was a possibility, I wouldn't even bother because I would not have believed myself. I would have been like, 5 years from now, Heidi, whatever path you think you're on, you are wrong. Get back here and hide every part of yourself. If there's anything I'm sure of, it's that your authentic self is not ever going to bring you love or connection in the world. And this is one of those times where it just feels so good to be wrong. The more we heal, the more we intuitively learn that not only can other people love us because of who we are, not despite it, we can also love ourselves in that way. We can look back at the lives we've had and all of the maladapting coping mechanisms we use to get through that life, and we can be grateful for every past version of ourselves. So what I now know is that healing is not ever going to make me look like a person who is raised securely attached and has no history of developmental trauma. But it is going to make me look like the person I actually am, which is a person who fought her entire life the best that she could, and I can be genuinely proud of every past version of myself that in some way brought me here. Which leads us neatly into the 10th and last thing we're going to talk about today, which is that a big part of the complex PTSD or toxic shame healing process is dropping what Pete Walker calls the salvation fantasy and accepting that there is no state in which you are going to feel permanently good, happy, loved, accepted, and okay forever. Life has ebbs and flows, and I really love what Pete Walker talks about in his book as the continuum between surviving and thriving. So there are going to be periods in all of our lives where we feel like we are absolutely knocking it out of the ballpark. And if you have a history of complex trauma, those times may feel few and far between. So when they come up in the healing process, you might feel kind of desperate to cling on to them and to make sure that now that you have this feeling of health and vitality and aliveness, you never want to lose it. And then the tectonic plates of your life are going to shift as they always do, and at some point you will find yourself back in a period where you are just trying to keep your head above water, that period of being in survival mode. And the more we resist accepting that we're in one of those periods of surviving, the more we're likely to turn to those unhealthy coping mechanisms to kind of dissociate from the whole thing. So Pete Walker in his book once again talks about how self-medicating can be something that we do in order to try to prolong a state of thriving and refuse to accept that we're now in a survival state. And the way that I've come to like to think about it is that those survival periods are my opportunities to practice deep humility. No matter how much work I do in my life, I don't ever want to believe that I am above struggling. So whenever I find myself in that state of resisting something difficult that I'm going through, which happens frequently, I do not go down without a fight. I try to reframe it as it is my time to be taught. It is my time to humble myself and let life teach me whatever lesson I currently need to learn. So John Bradshaw, who wrote the incredible book, Healing the Shame That Binds You, talks about how people who have shame-bound identities tend to think of themselves as either less than human, so kind of broken, flawed, and no good, or more than human, so kind of pumping up our egos to compensate for what we lack in genuine self-love. So when I catch myself feeling less than human and telling myself things like I deserve poor treatment, or other people are inherently worthier or better than me and deserve good treatment that I do not deserve, I know that it's time to step into my dignity and to start tending to my own right to exist and to be valued. But when I'm feeling more than human and I'm kind of resisting my own suffering, I know that it's time to assume a position of humility and to step back and allow whatever lesson I need to be taught to me. And it's this strange kind of paradox that I find myself repeatedly arriving back at, that sometimes when I'm struggling the most and when I'm doing the most kind of self-sabotaging behaviors, what I actually need is more humility. I need to accept I'm not above struggling, I'm not above feeling sad, I'm not above being disappointed, and I can be grateful for the opportunities that are afforded to me through every season of my life, the good ones and the bad ones. Because once again, healing from complex PTSD, developmental trauma, or toxic shame does not mean our lives feel wonderful forever. It just means that during the darker periods, we are able to stay on our own teams because we finally believe that we are valuable human beings who are worth showing up and fighting for. And that includes fighting for our own dignity, personally and interpersonally. All right, these 10 things are far from the only things that you can expect out of the toxic shame or complex PTSD healing process. But I wanted to bring them up as some kind of realistic guideposts that you can look for as you move through this process. As always, let me know in the comments what you're thinking, feeling, experiencing as you watch this video. Also, as always, I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other and your inner children, and I will see you back here again really soon.